Thank you to Odoo for sponsoring this video, and welcome to Aviation Republic. My name is Joe. Draken's story started back in late 1949 in a small Swedish town where a young engineer named Eric Bratt was staring at a seemingly impossible problem with nothing but pencil, paper and a slide rule to solve it. News of the Bell X-1's supersonic flight had reached Sweden in 1947. For most of the world, it was a technological milestone, proof that humans could break the sound barrier and live to tell the tale. For the small engineering team at Svenska Aeroplan, better known as SAAB, it was something else entirely. It was an invitation. If supersonic flight was possible, then Sweden's next fighter would be supersonic. That decision was made almost immediately. What wasn't clear was how to actually build one. The question is, why would Sweden, a country with a population of less than 7 million people, need or want to build their own in-house supersonic aircraft? Well, it was because Sweden had a problem that few other countries faced. Sweden was at the time neutral and had been since 1814 after the Napoleonic Wars. And this neutrality meant Sweden couldn't rely on anyone else to defend her. They'd learned that lesson the hard way. Because 9 years earlier, in April 1940, German forces had seized Norway's Oslo airport. Within months, the American government had cut off deliveries of the 316 aircraft Sweden had ordered, worried they may end up in German hands. Only 62 ever arrived. The rest vanished into American inventory. Sweden were forced to buy whatever other countries were willing to sell, but the only ones willing to sell were Italy. But obsolete Fiat biplanes and Reggiani fighters that were at least current generation were not enough. It was desperation procurement. But in 1940, Sweden had no choice. At the stroke of a pen, Germany's invasion of Oslo had become Sweden's Pearl Harbor. This was a clear demonstration that in a world at war, a neutral country could only depend on their own domestic aircraft industry, otherwise they run the risk of being effectively defenceless. That experience led to the Swedish government's November 1940 basic agreement with SAAB, which formalized production commitments, at least 1,100 combat aircraft by mid-1946, with production rates up to 30 aircraft a month if required. But they weren't starting from scratch. Before the agreement, aircraft that would fulfill these commitments had already been in development. SAAB had taken over another aviation firm, ASJA, in March 1939, inheriting their project that became the SAAB 17 dive bomber along with the twin-engine SAAB 18. Then there was the J21 in 1943, Sweden's first significant indigenous fighter and the first real product to emerge from that basic agreement. It was also one of the only combat aircraft ever used operationally in both propeller-driven and jet-powered versions, the other being the Soviet Yak-15, though that was less a conversion and more a jet engine grafted onto an existing airframe. Let me know in the comments if there are any others. By 1948, SAAB had already flown the J29 Tanan, or the barrel, of which 661 would roll off the production lines. That track record, going from desperate 1940 procurement to delivering hundreds of Tanans, was a huge industrial achievement that no doubt needed managing thousands of contract schedules and suppliers. And speaking of keeping track of what's been delivered and what hasn't, I used to run a small business for many years, and as any small business owner knows, you have to wear every single hat. Sales, marketing, legal, customer service, tech support, and T-boy. Don't get me wrong, we love landing new customers, doing actual work, seeing the business do well. But there was one task that irked me to no end. The aftermath. Generating invoices, keeping track of what had been paid, what was outstanding, who needed a gentle reminder, and who'd conveniently forgotten to pay for 3 months. Then came the end of year accounts, making sure all the invoices were in order, cross-referencing bank statements, finding that one I'd sworn I'd sent but somehow ended up forgotten in the glove box of my car. Keeping track of all the paperwork was a monumental pain in the... The hours I could have spent actually growing the business were instead spent chasing numbers in a spreadsheet. That's why Odoo's invoicing application is a revelation. Creating an invoice that used to take me 10 minutes of faffing about with templates now can be done in seconds. You simply identify your customer, add their products or services, specify quantities, price, set your payment terms or due date, and hit send. Done. The invoice goes out by email and you can keep track of everything in one place in the chatter, where you can also log notes and schedule activities. Better yet, your customers can pay online through the portal using whatever method they prefer: Stripe, PayPal, whatever works for them. No more waiting for checks in the post or wondering if the bank transfer went through. And here's the clever bit: you can connect your bank account and automate the whole follow-up process. Clear payment statuses, due dates, reminders, all sorted without lifting a finger. But wait, there's more. The most splendid part: Odoo's first app is free for life. So if you'd rather spend time building your business rather than building mountains of paperwork, click the link in the description and give Odoo's invoicing app a try. Thank you to Odoo for sponsoring this video. Right, back to SAAB's and Eric Bratt's supersonic problem. So come 1949, Sweden knew how to build capable fighters. Now they just had to build a supersonic one, and quickly. Because across the Baltic Sea, within easy reach, sat an adversary that had just acquired nuclear weapons. And it would only be a matter of time before their squadrons of Tupolev Tu-4 bombers could carry the bomb to Western targets. Finland on the eastern border wasn't much of a buffer. They'd been forced into constrained neutrality after the Winter War, walking a fine line to keep the Soviets happy while staying technically independent. That border with the Reds was close, too close to comfort. It didn't help that Norway's NATO membership complicated Sweden's western border, putting them squarely in the path of any Soviet bomber heading for Norwegian targets or using their airspace as a corridor to the Atlantic. It was feared that in the time it took to brew a pot of coffee, the skies above Sweden would be darkened by hundreds of Soviet bombers. The Swedish response was pragmatic. If we can't join an alliance, we'll defend our neutrality by making violations expensive. Sure, fighters couldn't stop nuclear missiles, but in 1949 nuclear weapons were expected to be delivered by bombers that had to fly to their targets. Unfortunately for Sweden, her geography put them directly in the path of any Soviet bomber route heading west. But Sweden wasn't going to give Moscow a free corridor through their airspace. Every Soviet aircraft crossing Swedish territory was going to have to fight for every mile. Make that fight costly enough and maybe they'd think twice about violating Swedish neutrality in the first place. And to do this, what Sweden needed was something that could climb hard and fast to catch anything the Soviets sent and potentially bring it down. With this in mind, in September 1949, the Swedish Air Board released Project 1200 that laid out the requirement for their next interceptor. By October, SAAB received the formal study contract. The specifications were brutal. One mission: bring down Soviet bombers. To do this, the aircraft needed rapid interception capability, which means a climb rate fast enough to reach high-flying intruders before they entered Swedish airspace, and they had to intercept them day or night, regardless of conditions. In time, the definitive J35 would have a climb rate of almost 40,000 feet per minute. To put that into perspective, a combat-loaded Soviet MiG-21 could hit 46,000 feet per minute, and only one European interceptor could outclimb the Swedes, the English Electric Lightning, at 50,000 feet per minute. Draken could and would hold their own in very fast company. It would also be single-engined, not because Sweden wanted to save money, but because a twin-engine interceptor would be heavier and slower climbing. For intercepting the high-altitude bombers, climb rate mattered more than redundancy. But Eric Bratt's team knew better. The Tu-4 may have been slow and lumbering, but it was already operational, and the Swedish engineers knew that the Soviets wouldn't stop there. Their bombers would soon be faster and flying higher. So, even though Project 1200 requirements specified a maximum speed of Mach 1.4, Bratt understood that any interceptor design would also need built into it the ability to go faster, much faster, the so-called speed creep. Then came the requirements that made everything else nearly impossible. Sweden's entire Cold War air defense doctrine, BAS-60, was built around dispersal. If war came, Swedish aircraft wouldn't be sitting on big air bases waiting to be destroyed. They'd be scattered across the country on wartime road bases hidden in forests, using reinforced public roads as runways. A typical wartime strip was roughly 800 meters long and 12 to 13 meters wide. The logic was brutal but sound. Scatter fighters across dozens of small camouflage bases and a preemptive strike becomes prohibitively expensive. You can't destroy what you can't find, and you can't find if it's been well hidden in a forest. But dispersal created a different problem, one of support. The people servicing these dispersed aircraft wouldn't necessarily be seasoned technicians. They'd mostly be conscripts, 18-year-olds with basic training. The aircraft therefore had to be designed so these conscripts could refuel, rearm and turn them around in under 10 minutes using minimal tools, sometimes in the dark, often wearing thick gloves. If the aircraft wasn't maintainable under those conditions, then the entire BAS-60 doctrine didn't work. This was the entire plan. But there was an issue. In 1949, nobody had built anything remotely like this. And that was the problem 33-year-old Erik Bratt was pondering when he was handed Project 1200. So who was this engineer on which Sweden was gambling its future? Erik Bratt had been with SAAB since 1945, after spending 3 years with Skandinaviska Aero. By 1949, he'd been assigned as project manager responsible for supersonic aircraft development. But he was told not to worry, the position was temporary, just until somebody more experienced could be found. However, there was a slight complication. Of the 7 million people in Sweden, nobody had experience designing supersonic fighters. What are the odds? As Bratt himself later noted, there simply weren't any supersonic aircraft around, apart from the experimental Bell X-1. To nobody's surprise, no one with more experience showed up. Congratulations, Bratt, the job's yours. But Bratt was no rookie. He had earned his engineering degree from the Royal Institute of Technology in Stockholm in 1942, the country's most prestigious university for engineering. But his education wasn't confined to the classroom. He'd already earned his pilot's license in 1937 at the age of 21, then trained as a reserve pilot in the Swedish Air Force between 1940 and 1942, one of the Silver Wings, the name given to reservists. He understood aircraft from both sides, the cockpit and the drawing board. That combination, pilot and engineer, would prove essential. Bratt knew what pilots needed and what ground crews could manage under BAS-60 conditions. The core team started small, with just 12 engineers in late 1949. But by the time Draken reached production, more than 500 engineers and technicians would be working on the program at SAAB's facility in Linköping. Their task was simple to state and almost impossible to execute. However, Bratt's team weren't on their own. Unlike the American Operation Paperclip, which had taken hundreds of German scientists, or the Soviets who grabbed whomever they could, Sweden found themselves with just a handful of German engineers. 3 of them, Klaus Oswetich, Siegfried Erdmann and Hermann Berbaum, were ex-Peenemünde and Messerschmitt aerodynamicists who had been through various Allied hands before ending up in Sweden. These men undoubtedly helped design Draken, teaching the Swedes how to think about supersonic flight. They brought test methodologies, engineering knowledge and hard-won lessons from a decade of German research that would have taken the Swedish years to rediscover on their own. Sweden was building Draken alone, but they weren't starting from zero. One of the first problems they had to solve was wing geometry. Swept, delta, variable geometry, what shape would it take? They soon learned they were caught in a catch-22 situation. Low-speed handling for motorway strips and high supersonic performance are a trade-off. Swept wings like those on the F-86 Sabre or the MiG-15 worked well around Mach 0.8, good handling, reasonable landing characteristics. But at speeds past Mach 1.4 or 1.5, wave drag became a serious problem, one that would challenge every supersonic fighter program in the 1950s. Swept wings could only get you to high supersonic speeds efficiently, so they turned to pure delta wings. Deltas keep drag low at high speed and stay structurally efficient, ideal for pushing well beyond Mach 1.4. But, and there's always a but, a pure delta wing doesn't generate much lift at low speed unless the aircraft flies at a very high angle of attack, relying on powerful leading edge vortices. The aircraft has to pitch its nose way up, sometimes 15 or even 20 degrees. When it does, the airflow separates from the sharp leading edge and rolls into two tight vortices running along the top of the wing, creating a low pressure that sucks the aircraft upward. This is why pure delta fighters like the Mirage 3 come in nose high, looking like they're trying to sit back on their tails. They're riding those vortices all the way down to the tarmac. It works, but it comes at a high approach speed and long landing distances. Given the knowledge at the time, a pure delta couldn't have operated from Sweden's wartime motorway strips. By late 1949, Project 1200 design studies were piling up. Some with swept wings, some with pure deltas, some with tail surfaces, some without, all manner of variations in between, and nothing worked. Swept wings hit a wall at high Mach numbers, pure deltas couldn't land short enough, the requirements seemed mutually exclusive. You can optimize for one, but you'll pay for it in the other. The team couldn't settle on anything because nothing seemed to satisfy all the requirements simultaneously. But they had to find a solution because if they failed, then Sweden's interceptor program died. The Swedish Air Force would be stuck flying upgraded Tenans while Soviet bombers got faster and more capables. The Americans weren't likely to be selling any upcoming supersonic fighters to neutral countries. And as for the British, well, the Lightning was still many years away from service. Then an idea was proposed, one so radical that many doubted it would even work. If the swept wing could do one job and the delta could do the other, then why not use both? Imagine this, a design meeting at SAAB's Linköping facility. Eric Bratt walks in, carrying a blueprint for a wing design. He unrolls it in front of his colleagues. Some of the engineers sit up and stare, taking a moment to fully grasp what they're looking at. Others laugh nervously. Maybe a few of the old salt veteran aerodynamicists look at it with dismay. One or two might have said, "That'll never fly." It looks wrong, just unnatural. Nothing with a wing like that could possibly fly. Now, I don't know if this meeting actually happened, but Bratt and his colleagues were playing a high-stakes game with an unusual, untested configuration that was Sweden's shot at supersonic interception. Bizarre looking as the wing design was, the man behind the drawing wasn't reckless, far from it. Eric Bratt wasn't a mad scientist sketching triangles on napkins. He was the kind of engineer who would triple-check a calculation before letting anyone else see it. He understood personally that if he missed a decimal point somewhere, someone would eventually pay for it with their lives. And yet he was also the one willing to bet his reputation and possibly Sweden's entire air defense on a wing that looked like it'd been snapped in half. So, how did they get to this odd-looking wing? By November 1949, Bratt's team had been examining every option they could think of. They started with a plain delta. The wingspan and overall dimensions had been determined by the ceiling requirement, and the root chord was fixed by the fuel volume needed for the interceptor mission. But after much study, they calculated that a pure delta sized for fuel volume and high altitude flight had far more wing area than necessary for transonic and supersonic performance. And this was bad. In the transonic regime, right before and just beyond Mach 1, any excess wing area generated severe wave drag, an aerodynamic penalty that made even small design compromises feel like you're pushing a barn door through the sky. But if they reduced the wing area, the landing speeds and distances would increase, so they had a problem. They needed a thick enough wing to hold fuel and landing gear, which inevitably produced too much area, destroying their transonic and supersonic performance, yet the small area they wanted for high-speed flight would make the airplane unforgiving on approach. Standard Delta logic said, pick your compromise and live with it. But Bratt's team asked a different question. What if we didn't compromise? The answer, keep the wing thick and deep where you need the volume, near the fuselage, but reduce the unnecessary area further out. The sharp crank in the leading edge was the cleanest way to do exactly that, a sharply swept inner section for high-speed performance and a less aggressive outer section for low-speed lift and control, perfect for landing on short forest roads. This clever combination also had the benefits of the area rule, which was normally seen on specially shaped fuselages like that on the B-58 Hustler or the F-102 without needing the fuselage to be narrowed into a Coke bottle shape or adding extra bumps and lumps. But the real magic was in the specifics on how the wing actually worked, so brace yourselves, the next section is absolutely cracking. So, the Draken's 80-degree swept back inner wing behaved aerodynamically like a razor-thin wing, far thinner than it actually was. This allowed the aircraft to reach and maintain supersonic speeds without suffering the massive drag penalties a thick wing would normally impose. This was all thanks to the long chord relative to its thickness. By keeping the thickness to chord ratio low, the inner wing performed like a thin wing at high speed, yet retained a physically deep root to house fuel, landing gear and avionics, all the volume the aircraft needed without paying the usual drag penalty. Every component was strategically tucked behind something else, the engine behind the pilot, the fuel tanks and main landing gear behind the intakes. The wing essentially became part of the fuselage, a blended wing body decades before the term became common. So that's high-speed flight and internal volume sorted, but what about low speed and coming into land at short strips? Well, at low speeds, the outer panels behave like a conventional, moderately swept wing. But the real magic came from the 80-degree inboard leading edge. Anytime Draken pitched nose up, whether in a hard turn or flaring for landing, the inner wing would begin to generate a pair of vortices. These spinning tunnels of air would stay tight and coherent as they swept across the crank or dogtooth and out over the outer panels all the way to the wingtips. By keeping the airflow firmly attached, the vortices generated a huge amount of extra lift. That extra lift let Draken fly slowly, nose high, while remaining fully controllable. It's not surprising, this is called the leading edge vortex lift principle, or in SAAB's documentation, simply the double delta vortex lift. While almost every other delta-winged fighter of the era reached their limits around 16 to 18 degrees, beyond that the wing was stalled, Draken could safely pitch its nose to 26-28 degrees and keep flying. As the angle of attack increased, the vortex suction moved forward, moving the center of pressure with it and giving natural pitch stability all the way to the stall limit. In effect, the aircraft gained nearly 10 extra degrees of free lift purely from the shape of its double delta wing. The payoff was enormous. Pilots could make slow, controlled approaches to short strips with landing rolls of around 800 meters in the early Draken, but much less when using a drag chute and lift dumps. It was like having built-in leading-edge flaps, but without any moving parts. The wing did all the work. On the drawing board, it solved everything. High supersonic performance from the inner wing, slow speed handling from the outer wing, all the internal volume and strength they needed. 2 deltas, 1 wing, no horizontal tail. It's sort of simple when you think about it, and that's why Draken looks the way it does. But SAAB weren't putting all their eggs into one basket. At the same time, they'd been running a parallel study, Project 1220, a more conventional swept-wing supersonic aircraft. Project 1220 was supposed to be the safe bet. SAAB had already built a swept-wing fighter and were working on the J32 Lansen. They understood the risk, the quirks and the limits. They were working with proven predictable aerodynamics, but once the numbers came in, the safer option started to show its limits. As we know, a swept wing could meet the short field performance requirements, landed on road bases and taken off from improvised strips. That part was manageable, but pushing past Mach 1.4, the drag numbers spiked like hitting a brick wall. They'd need a bigger engine, more fuel, more structure, and that all meant more weight. Making the low speed problem worse, it was a vicious cycle. And the Double Delta broke that cycle. On paper, it solved everything Project 1220 couldn't. But not everyone was convinced. Even after the numbers showed the Double Delta's advantages, some kept pushing for the conventional swept-wing design. Even the Swedish Air Board's second-in-command, Major General Bengt Jakobsen, was not impressed when he paid a visit to SAAB to take a look at what they'd been up to. Bratt and SAAB's chief project leader, Lars Brissing, walked him through both configurations. The radical Double Delta with no tail and the more conventional layout with the swept wing and horizontal stabilizers. They laid out the advantages, the disadvantages, the performance and trade-offs and the risks of each design. After the briefing, Brissing asked if the Major General had anything to add. Jakobsen's response was blunt. "You can build a damn plane however you want, but it shall have a tail." And it wasn't without merit. A tailless aircraft made people nervous. There were stability concerns and questions about control authority. After the general left, Bratt and Brissing had a quiet conversation. They agreed to make drawings of the Double Delta with a tail, something they could pull out and show during future visits from Prime Air Force officials. It was a hedge, a way to keep everyone calm while they kept working on what they knew was the better solution. But the debate didn't end there. Sometime later, Erik Bratt got a phone call that the Chief of the Air Force, Bengt Nordenskjöld, would be coming up and would SAAB kindly present their thoughts on the new Supersonic interceptor. Once again, Bratt and Brissing laid out both alternatives, the swept wing and the Double Delta, the same trade-offs, the same calculations and the same risks. When they had finished, Nordenskjöld asked a simple question: which aircraft is best? Bratt didn't hesitate. He said, "In my opinion, the Double Delta is best." Nordenskjöld looked at him and said, "Then why are you working on anything else? From now on, you only work on that aircraft." And with that, the Air Force chief stood up and left the room. The decision had been made. No more hedging, no more drawings with tails to show nervous generals. By May 1950, Project 1220 was formally shelved. Sweden had just gone all in on the Double Delta. Nobody had ever flown before. This radical wing, the one that looked like a broken triangle, was now Sweden's only bet. But drawings and equations can only get you so far. Could it actually fly? What they needed was a wind tunnel. The problem was that Sweden had exactly one supersonic wind tunnel in 1950, which sounds impressive until you realize it could only test 1 in 50 scale models, tiny replicas that you could fit in your hand. That might sound sufficient, except for one problem. At that scale, you can't capture what actually happens in a transonic region. This is the messy zone between subsonic and supersonic flight, where shock waves form, interact, and do generally unpredictable things. To really understand what's going on, you need large-scale testing to see how those shock waves behave. Sweden just didn't have that capability, so they built one. SAAB, with government backing, constructed their own transonic wind tunnel at Linköping. But even that wasn't enough. The team needed confirmation from multiple facilities running different tests to be certain the maths wasn't lying to them. They asked the National Aeronautical Research Establishment and the Royal Institute of Technology in Stockholm to check their homework. They even sent models across the Atlantic to NASA's wind tunnels at Langley and Ames. The data came back in big, thick reports, pages filled with pressure distributions, flow separations, drag coefficients at various Mach numbers. All undoubtedly fascinating stuff, but just to be sure the numbers added up, SAAB's engineers fed equations into the company's in-house computers, and the government-owned BESK machine in Stockholm, one of the fastest computers in the world in the early 50s. BESK? Now this is an interesting machine. BESK was a vacuum tube monster that filled an entire room and consumed enough electricity to heat a small town. And with all that power, it could churn through aerodynamic calculations, structural loads, and performance predictions at speeds that seemed miraculous compared to the slide rules and electromechanical computers that had been used to design everything from the Spitfire to the B-29. The output came on punch cards and printouts, reams of data that Bratt's team pored over, searching for weaknesses, checking assumptions, making sure that nothing had been missed. If they'd missed something in the equations or misread the wind tunnel data, they wouldn't know until a test pilot tried to land the thing, and by then it might be too late. Then came the full-scale torture tests. Wind tunnels are clean, controlled environments. Real aircraft operate in turbulent air, pull high-G maneuvers, and experience vibrations that no wind tunnel could fully replicate. So what did they do? Well, they constructed a 30-foot diameter Ferris wheel rig to test the fuel system under simulated flight conditions. With this contraption, they could spin full-size fuel tanks and their components to replicate the G-forces, vibrations, and the violence of combat maneuvering. All of this testing was vital. Fuel slosh in high-G turns and sudden directional changes would shift the center of gravity mid-maneuver, making the aircraft uncontrollable. The Ferris wheel told them where to put baffles, how to design the tank structure, and which pump configurations would survive operational stresses. Since Draken was expected to intercept Soviet bombers above 50,000 feet and possibly as high as 60 to 65,000 feet, they built a climatic chamber that could test structural components at temperature extremes down to -70°C and simulated altitudes up to 98,000 feet. Swedish winters are cold, but not that cold. But they needed to know what happened when metal contracted beyond anything nature could throw at it. They needed to know when hydraulic fluid thickened, when seals became brittle, when electronic components stopped working. Every component, every rivet, every seal, every wire had to survive those conditions without failing. They even fired frozen chickens at supersonic speeds into cockpit windscreens. A solid windscreen is important. Bird strikes at 1,000 miles an hour aren't much fun for the pilot or the bird. Colliding with a 1 kilo seagull at Mach 1.4 hits with roughly 90,000 joules, about the same as 40 rifle rounds arriving at once. The results of these tests were messy. Some windscreens shattered, others cracked but held. With this data, they were able to build windscreens that could survive a direct bird strike. Those chickens served their country well. But before Sweden invested even more enormous sums and manpower into a program, they needed to know if the double delta would actually fly. The unknowns were enormous. There was no computer with enough power to simulate the configuration and give them the definitive answer. The design had thus far relied on wind tunnels, remote-controlled models, water tanks, and whatever the giant best computer had calculated. The data suggested the double delta would work, but suggested wasn't good enough. Bratt's team knew they couldn't jump straight into a full-size prototype. The risk was too high. So, in May 1950, early in the design stages, just around when Project 1220 had been ditched in favour of the double delta, they made a decision, one that English Electric would emulate a few years later. SAAB would build a scaled-down aircraft. Little Draken would be a flying laboratory. Its sole purpose was to prove that a double delta winged aircraft could fly and fly well. The radical wing concept was about to face its first real-world test. If it flew, Sweden would have its interceptor. If it failed, there was no plan B. 20 months, that's how long SAAB gave themselves to take their scaled-down machine, the SAAB 210, nicknamed the Little Draken, from rubber stamp to first flight. SAAB had to move fast because they didn't have the luxury of time. Soviet bomber technology wasn't standing still. Every month of delay meant another month when Swedish airspace could only be defended by the aging J-29 Tunan, a perfectly competent subsonic fighter that would be hopelessly outclassed by whatever the Reds were developing next. In 1951, the F-100 Super Sabre, America's first true supersonic fighter, was still on the drawing board, and the British Electric Lightning wouldn't fly as the P-1 until 1954. I say this so that we can appreciate the scale of the challenge Eric Bratt and his team of about 10 engineers were facing. This was an all hands to the pumps project, with many being pulled off other work because Little Draken was now the highest priority in the building. The construction itself followed conventional stress skin principles, aluminium sheet over internal frames, with the fuselage and inner wing built as one integrated structure. Beyond the wing itself, the nose intake configuration was an interesting choice. These were two oval-shaped ducts separated in the middle by a small nose cone in the form of a pyramid that was later changed to a chisel shape. Some of the details got creative out of necessity though. They borrowed an ejection seat from an old J21, which ended up dictating the entire cockpit layout. The canopy was detachable, pull a handle, and the whole thing would blow off if the pilot needed to get out in a hurry. Whilst researching this story, I had to translate a lot of documents from the original Swedish, and for some reason the word catapult stol, which literally translates to catapult seat, made me laugh out loud. It sounds like something from a medieval siege weapon. The landing gear was only half retractable, with no doors and no complex mechanisms. Hydraulics pulled it up, gravity dropped it back down. Elegantly simple and perfectly adequate for what was essentially a flying test rig. For the engine, SAAB chose the Armstrong Siddeley Adder, a British turbojet that squeezed out all of 1,050 pounds of thrust at sea level, which is engineer speak for just enough to get it into the air. But that was precisely the point. Little Draken wasn't meant to break speed records or reach anywhere near supersonic speeds, it just needed enough thrust to get the machine to around 370 miles an hour. It was meant to prove that a double delta wing could handle low speed flight without becoming uncontrollable, and for that mission, the modest Adder was adequate. And it's not that a Little Draken was a large machine, just over 6 meters long from nose to tail and a wingspan of 4.8 meters, half the length and width of the future J35. The little aircraft could fit comfortably inside a typical suburban American 2-car garage. One particularly clever addition was a trim tank system. Since nobody knew exactly where the center of pressure would end up across the flight envelope, they installed 2 tanks, one forward, one aft, filled with a water glycol mixture. If Little Draken started behaving oddly at a certain speed or angle of attack, the pilot could pump the liquid between the tanks mid-flight, shifting the aircraft's center of gravity on command, literally move the aircraft's balance point and see if that helped. The system was later replaced with swappable weights that could be changed on the ground. By February 1951, the design of the 210 was finalized and sent to SAAB's experimental workshop, a specialized facility where prototypes were built. From here, construction moved rapidly, and by early November, Little Draken was ready for engine runs and taxi tests. And that's when the problems started to show up, as they always do when theory meets hardware. During initial ground testing, the control servos, hydraulic actuators that moved the ailerons, began vibrating violently at certain engine speeds. This hadn't happened during bench tests running off an external hydraulic pump, which baffled everyone until someone realized what was different. The external pump's long connecting hose had been dampening pressure spikes in the hydraulic lines. Remove that hose, connect everything internally using shorter lines, and suddenly the servos were shaking themselves apart. The solution? Run an 8-meter hydraulic hose inside the wing between the pump and the servos, replicating the dampening effect they'd accidentally discovered. For the first taxi test, Bengt Olo, SAAB's chief test pilot, was in the cockpit. These runs were naturally cautious, no point in being too keen when you're testing a new configuration. Jay just rolled down the runway at modest speeds, testing the brakes, steering and control response. Olo reported that Little Draken seemed to track straight, the directional stability appeared solid, and the controls felt light, maybe even too light, but there was no immediate cause for alarm. On one high-speed taxi trial, Olo pushed the throttle forward until the aircraft reached around 110 miles an hour, and that's when the aircraft began to feel light on its wheels. Not a pitch up, not an attempt to take off, just that subtle weightlessness that anyone who has piloted an aircraft will understand. That moment right before liftoff when the wings are generating enough lift to take the weight off the landing gear. Which raised the obvious question, should they let it fly? See, the problem was the weather. December in Sweden meant short days, long nights and snowstorms that could shut down flying for weeks. The test team had a narrow window and they were losing daylight with every delay, so they kept doing high-speed taxi runs and waited to see what would happen. What happened were unintentional hops. Little Draken lifted a meter or two off the runway before settling back down. Brief moments of flight that proved the wing generated lift but told them nothing about how the aircraft actually behaved. Then winter properly arrived. Weeks passed while Little Draken sat in its hangar and the SAAB team waited for weather that would finally let them fly the thing properly. January the 21st, 1952. Clear skies and light winds over Linköping. The kind of winter morning Swedish test pilots dream about. Olo climbed at Little Draken's cramped cockpit, this time not for another taxi run, but for the real thing. He worked through the checklist methodically. Hydraulics, green and holding. Controls, full and free. Fuel, pumps on, flow confirmed. He lit the adder, let it spool up and taxied to the runway threshold. One last check. Temperatures and pressures in the green. Once he was happy, feet off the brakes, Olo opened the throttle and Little Draken began to accelerate down the runway. At about 110 miles an hour, he eased back on the stick. The nose came up, the wheels left the tarmac, and Little Draken climbed into that clear blue Swedish sky. For the next 25 minutes, Olo flew conservative circuits, just gentle turns, checking basic control response and general behavior to make sure the aircraft wasn't hiding any nasty surprises. So far, everything was working exactly as predicted. Then came the landing. Landing a Delta requires a high angle of attack, the nose pitched up so far that forward visibility disappears completely. Olo practiced this mentally, but doing it for real in an aircraft no one had ever landed before was another thing entirely. He opted for a long, shallow approach, essentially a fast, flat glide that minimized angle of attack but consumed a lot of runway. Touchdown came at around 120 miles an hour with no flare, just a gentle settling onto the wheels. Little Draken rolled to a stop. Everyone at SAAB could breathe again. Actually, there's an amusing footnote here. Back in early December 1951, weeks before the actual first flight, SAAB made an odd announcement to the press, claiming that their experimental aircraft had completed its first flight, even though it hadn't actually technically flown yet, except for a few hops. Perhaps somebody in the publicity department got a bit overexcited, or perhaps they were just getting their press releases ready a touch too early. The name Draken, which means the kite, as well as the dragon in Swedish, came from the wing shape rather than any fire-breathing beasts of yore, and as dramatic as the name sounds, it was said that Erik Bratt wasn't particularly fond of the name, but regardless, the double delta could fly, and that simple fact changed everything. Draken program now had its proof of concept, and within months the Swedish Air Force ordered 3 full-scale prototypes. But Little Draken's work was far from finished. Early flights had shown that the nose-mounted air intakes, originally chosen for aerodynamic cleanliness, weren't providing sufficient airflow to the ABBA engine. At certain speeds and angles of attack, the intake was essentially starving the engine of air. SAAB's solution was straightforward enough. Relocate intakes to the sides of the fuselage just after the cockpit. The modification worked beautifully. Airflow improved, the engine ran properly across the entire flight envelope, and the side intake configuration became the definitive layout for every Draken that followed. Over the next 4.5 years, the redesigned 210B, as it was now called, would fly test after test. Sources vary on the exact numbers. Some cite 887 test flights, clocking up 286 hours in the air. Others reference over 1,000 flights. But what matters is that the little aircraft spent years proving the double delta concept in every configuration SAAB could think to test. Some tests were routine enough: stability checks, control response, stall characteristics at different speeds, and center of gravity positions. Others were decidedly less routine. They glued wool tufts over the wings, hundreds of them, each one a tiny wind indicator, and mounted a camera on the fin to photograph airflow patterns. Pilots would then fly specific profiles while narrating observations into a tape recorder, calling out speeds, attitudes, and such like, dictating as much detail as possible for the engineers back on the ground. At one point they even tested adding a horizontal stabilizer. Remember General Jakobsen back in Chapter 2, the one who insisted Draken should have a tail? SAAB humoured him with characteristic Swedish politeness. They designed a tail, built a model, and tested it thoroughly. The results were unambiguous. Adding a horizontal stabilizer made everything worse. Those powerful vortices coming off the leading edge, responsible for so much lift at high angles of attack, would hit the stabilizer and collapse. And once the vortices collapsed, the wing lost lift and the controls lost authority. It was clear that Draken would remain tailless. Jakobsen's intuition, well-meaning as it was wrong. But perhaps the most dramatic discovery came during testing in early 1953. Test pilot Oleg Klinker was conducting a routine envelope expansion test, flying slower and slower with an increase in angle of attack to find the stall boundary. Around 80 miles an hour, with the nose pitched up to around 25 degrees, something unexpected happened. The nose snapped upward violently to nearly vertical, then it fell through just as sharply. The aircraft began oscillating, nose high, nose low, in a pendulum motion, rotating slowly left, descending rapidly, and none of Klinker's control inputs seemed to make any difference whatsoever. Little Draken had just entered a superstall. Many deltas don't stall violently, they just stop flying. Instead of spinning, they sink like a dropped manhole cover. Little Draken was no exception. It didn't depart, it simply fell, stable, predictable, unresponsive, and absolutely terrifying. Klinker tried everything. Full forward stick, no effect. Full aft, nothing. Throttle adjustments only changed the rate of oscillations. Altitude bled away. 3,000 feet, 2,000 feet, 1,000 feet. Klinker reached for the ejection seat handle. Then during one forward swing, the airspeed ticked up just enough for the elevons to buy the airflow again. He snapped the stick forward, broke the stall, and pulled out with barely 300 feet to spare. Little Draken wasn't the first aircraft to fall into a superstall, but it was the first tailless double delta to do it and live to tell the tale, thanks to a mix of luck and exceptional pilot skill, years before the term superstall was even coined. Back on the ground, engineers pored over the data and derived the recovery technique: stick full aft, then snap it full forward during a forward swing to break the stall before the aircraft pitches up again. It would later become standard Draken training. What has always impressed me about this incident is how Klinker kept his head clear enough to recognize that brief moment when recovery became possible. Most pilots would likely have already pulled the ejection handle. But at the time, it was simply another aerodynamic oddity, something to avoid rather than a maneuver that would one day make a Soviet test pilot famous. Little Draken kept flying through 1953 and all the way into 1956, long after the full-scale Draken had already flown. The final flight was flown on October 25th, 1956 by Ceylon Utterborn, just a routine test hop, nothing as dramatic as Klinker's flight a few years earlier. Today, Little Draken sits in the Swedish Air Force Museum at Linköping, slightly battered, missing its engine, sporting dummy weapons it never carried. But it had done its job. It proved the double delta worked. It gave SAAB the confidence to build a full-size interceptor around a radical wing configuration that existed nowhere else in the world. Now, it was time to build the actual Draken. I want to take a second here to thank you so much for watching. I'm truly grateful to share my love of aviation with fellow enthusiasts like you. So if you're enjoying this story, please take a quick second to hit the like button. It's a small gesture that makes a huge difference in helping me reach more aviation fans. Now let's get back to the story. October the 25th, 1955, 3.5 years after Little Draken proved the double delta concept would work, Bengt Olu found himself climbing into another prototype aircraft at Linköping. But this time, there was nothing little about it. The prototype sitting on the tarmac, designated FPL 35-1, though everyone was already calling it the Stordraken, the big kite, was a proper interceptor. Longer, heavier, faster, and powered by an engine that could actually generate meaningful thrust. Wingspan was just under 10 meters, or 9.42 meters to be precise, nearly double that of the 210. The wing area came to 49 square meters, roughly half the area of a tennis court. Length 15.35 meters, nose to tail. Olu had flown the little 210 dozens of times, understood its quirks, and knew exactly how the double delta behaved across the flight envelope. That experience was no doubt reassuring, to a point anyway. But the full-scale Draken wasn't just a bigger Little Draken, it was an entirely different proposition. 8 tons of aluminium, fuel, and a single turbojet, all wrapped around that radical wing configuration that nobody had ever flown at this size before. The maths said it would work, Little Draken said it would work, now Olu would find out if they were both right. That day, sat in the cockpit, he worked through the pre-flight checklist methodically, going through the same ritual. Controls responsive, hydraulics pressurized, fuel balanced, instruments green and reading normally. Olu signaled to the ground crew, released the brakes and taxied to the threshold. Maybe a quiet word with the gods, then feet off the brake, throttle forward. The engine spooled up and Draken accelerated down the runway. At around 150 miles an hour, Olu eased the stick back and the nose lifted cleanly. Moments later, the main wheels left the ground. No drama, no expected pitch up, just a smooth, predictable climb into the clear Swedish sky. For the next 30 minutes, Olu once again flew conservatively, like he did with the 210 on its maiden flight, gentle turns and checking the basic controls and systems, making sure that the full-scale aircraft behaved as predicted, that scaling up from the smaller Little Draken hadn't created any nasty aerodynamic surprises. The wind tunnel data and Little Draken test program had both been vindicated. The double delta worked at full scale, and that simple fact made all the previous years of development worthwhile. Landing needed the same angle of attack as Little Draken, using a long, shallow approach that ate up half the runway but kept the nose relatively level. Touchdown came smoothly at around 124 miles an hour. Draken rolled to a stop, and the SAAB engineers, who must have been holding their collective breaths, finally relaxed. From that point, the initial test program focused on proving the aircraft wouldn't kill anyone, which seemed a reasonable starting point. But once the basic handling was sorted, performance testing began in earnest. Exact climb figures for the prototypes aren't available, but the first production J35A variants give us a clue. The official service ceiling was rated at around 49,000 feet, but in practice the aircraft was only reaching around 42,000 feet, which wasn't quite enough to reliably intercept threats operating at maximum altitude. It was clear though that the engineers had certainly built a fine machine and that the airframe had plenty of potential, but it would need more powerful engines to reach where Soviet bombers would actually be flying. Bigger engines would indeed come. Swedish doctrine assumed dispersed highway bases and conscript mechanics with basic tools. The fuselage had been built in 2 sections, forward and rear bolted together at midsection. Therefore, in the event the engine had to be changed, they simply unbolted the rear fuselage, slid the engine out backwards, swapped it and bolted everything back together. The outer wing sections detached just as easily for transport. Maybe this is where IKEA got their ideas from. Here's something for all the hardcore aviation nerds. Even the hydraulic system didn't escape Saab's obsession with reducing weight. It was pressurized at 210 kilograms per square centimeter. It was more than double the pressure of the earlier J29. But why is this number significant? Well, simply put, higher pressure meant smaller hardware. double the pressure, and you only need half the piston area to generate the same force. Smaller pistons meant smaller actuators, slimmer plumbing, and a modest reduction in the volume of hydraulic fluid sloshing around the airframe. In an aircraft where every kilogram had to earn its keep, that was weight Saab could relocate to things that actually mattered, such as fuel, weapons, and the actual structure. Controls were fully powered, which is great, but fully powered controls don't provide any natural feedback, meaning the pilots had no tactile sense of aerodynamic load-in. Pull the stick in a conventional fighter and you feel resistance. In Draken, you felt practically nothing. Saab therefore installed a Q-feel system, artificial generators that basically faked aerodynamic forces on the stick based on dynamic pressure. Not perfect, but it prevented pilots from over-controlling at high speed, which was the important bit. But whilst that first flight was a big win for the airframe design, getting to that point meant overcoming a problem that had nearly derailed the entire program before the 35-1 even left the ground. And the source of that problem was the engine. The Svenska Flygmotor RM5A sitting in the prototype's rear fuselage was the end of a dream and the beginning of a compromise that Swedish engineers had spent years trying to avoid. Though I should note that while researching the story, some sources claim that the prototype was actually powered by a Rolls-Royce Avon that Saab had borrowed directly from the British rather than a license-built RM5A. The documentation isn't entirely clear on this point, but either way, the engine itself represented the same compromise. Sweden had never wanted to rely on foreign engines. The plan, ambitious but logical for a country with Sweden's technical expertise, had been to develop indigenous turbojets that could power everything from Lansen aircraft to the SuperSonic Draken interceptor. Two companies were competing for the work, Svenska Flygmotor with their centrifugal designs and Stahl with their more sophisticated axial flow engines. By mid-1949, the Air Board had made its choice. Stahl's axial design, specifically the Dovern turbojet, would power Lansen, and the even more powerful Glan, still on the drawing board, would propel Draken to Mark II. Dovern took years of development work and was to be the source of considerable national pride. Chief designer Kurt Nicolin and his team at Stahl's facility had created a sophisticated engine with a 9-stage axial compressor that fed 9 combustion chambers and a single-stage turbine. With help from the British, they were able to fill the component gaps, such as fitting Lucas fuel controls, mnemonic flame tubes, and Jessup steel turbine discs. But it can't be stressed enough, the overall design was Swedish. By comparison, the British Avon followed a noticeably different design philosophy. While the engineers at Stahl focused on compactness, the Avon had a far more elaborate multi-stage axial compressor and a more refined cannula burner system to reach higher pressure ratios and greater thrust. In effect, Britain was pushing for maximum performance through complexity, whereas Sweden pursued efficiency and manufacturability through elegant simplicity. The two engines shared broad principles but diverged sharply in execution. But having said all that, the Dovern worked. Well, eventually. Getting there required solving problems that would have killed lesser programs. To give you an idea of the problems they faced, during bench testing, turbine blades would snap off due to resonance vibrations, which meant time and resources to redesign them with more rigidity. Then the turbine bearings failed, which needed additional modifications to the cooling and lubrication system. The changes mounted into the thousands, literally thousands, as engineers discovered that solving one issue inevitably revealed another. Compressor surging, blow-off valve timing, combustor flame stability, all the problems that Stanley Hooker and his team had already experienced. Each problem got catalogued, analysed and eventually solved, though never as quickly as the program managers would have liked. But finally, by July 1952, Dovern was finally ready for flight testing. And to do this, Saab borrowed an Avro Lancaster, redesignated the TP-80 in Swedish service and mounted the turbojet in a streamlined nacelle beneath the fuselage. The engine ran beautifully, over 300 hours of flight tested and 4,000 total hours including bench runs. Dovern was producing approximately 7,300 pounds of thrust at 7,200 RPM. Glan, intended for Draken, had reached the component manufacture stage and was projected to deliver around 11,000 pounds of thrust dry with over 15,000 with afterburner. Sweden was on the verge of joining a very exclusive club of nations that could design, build and produce their own high-performance turbojet engines. More importantly, they'd be in control of their own destiny. No waiting for export licenses, no dependency on foreign suppliers, no compromises forced by someone else's strategic priorities. It all looked like it was coming together, until in November 1952 when everything stopped completely. The decision had come from the top. Both Dovern and Glan were to be cancelled immediately with no phased shutdown, no transition period, just dead programs and thousands of hours of development work consigned to history. The reason? Well, Rolls-Royce had made an offer the Swedes couldn't refuse. And for Rolls-Royce, the timing was perfect. Well, from their perspective. Britain needed export sales to justify continued Avon development, and Sweden needed proven engines whilst hemorrhaging money trying to develop its own. The offer was, to be fair, quite generous. It included licensing rights for the entire Avon family, extremely favourable financial terms, and crucially, full access to future Avon developments. For the Swedish government, the maths was brutally clear. Indigenous engine development had become unsustainably expensive. The population of Sweden remained smaller than London or New York, which meant the tax base couldn't support the kind of long-term investment that turbojets demanded. And whilst Dovern had finally been sorted after years of problems, the A1 had already accumulated 30,000 flight hours and was proven reliable and, more importantly, available now. Svenska Flygmotor would build A1s under license, but Stahl's turbojet work would end, the Glan would never run, and Dovern would never power an operational aircraft. Swedish engineers took it about as well as you'd expect. The decision left Saab in an awkward position. Lansen had been designed around Dovern and now needed redesigning around the A1 RM6. Draken, which hadn't yet even flown, would have to use the British engines from the start, the very thing the entire indigenous engine program had been meant to avoid. But there was a silver lining, though it would take a while to become apparent. The Avon was a fundamentally better engine than anything Sweden could have developed on its budget. More thrust, better fuel consumption, easier maintenance, and, most importantly, Rolls-Royce's engineering team had already solved most of the problems that would have plagued Swedish engines for years. Still, using British engines stung, especially when Svenska Flygmotor engineers started developing their own afterburners to mate with the license-built Avons, which led to a whole new set of problems. Just as Sweden's engine ambitions were collapsing, the airframe itself was proving everything the wind tunnel models had promised. The problem now was making everything else around it work too. The first production Drakens, designated J35As, with the Swedish military's typical flair for memorable names, came with the RM6B engine and a Swedish-designed afterburner called the EBK65. 65 aircraft got this configuration, officially known as the J35A1, though pilots and ground crews called them Adam Court, Adam Short. With the EBK65 fitted, the engine can now push out 15,000 pounds of thrust with the afterburner lit, which was more than respectable. The whole engine assembly was relatively compact. That meant the rear fuselage could be kept short. This created a problem during landing. Remember, delta wings require high angle of attack for landing, sometimes 12 to 15 degrees nose up. From that attitude, with a short tail, the rear fuselage was uncomfortably close to the tarmac. Saab's solution was pragmatic: fit a small, solid tail skid to protect the underside during landing. The tail skid did its job, Technically, it prevented structural damage. It also left a spectacular trail of sparks down the runway every time a pilot misjudged the flare, which was both impressive and mildly concerning for everyone watching. The improved EBK-66 afterburner addressed this problem while adding 600 to 700 pounds more thrust. Excellent news for performance. Unfortunately, it was also longer. Significantly longer, long enough that fitting it into the existing rear fuselage wasn't possible without extending the entire tail section. So the last 25 J35As, also called the Adam Lang or Adam Long, got a lengthened rear fuselage to accommodate the more powerful afterburner. This meant replacing the tail skid with something more sophisticated. SAAB engineers came up with a brilliantly simple solution, a set of retractable double tail wheels, quickly nicknamed the roller skate wheels. The wheels retracted into the lengthened tail during flight and deployed automatically during landing, meaning pilots could use the full nose-high attitude for maximum aerodynamic braking without turning the rear fuselage into a grinding stone. As a bonus, the longer tail unexpectedly reduced drag, which meant the EBK-66 aircraft were not only more powerful, but also slightly more efficient. Sometimes engineering problems solve themselves after a fashion. While SAAB was sorting the afterburners and tail lengths, the prototype flight test program was running into problems of its own. The second prototype, FPL-35-2, flew for the first time in March 1956. Unlike the cautious 35-1, which had flown without an afterburner, the second prototype carried the more powerful Avon Mark 46 and an operational afterburner from day one. The test pilot lit it during the climb and accidentally broke the sound barrier on the first flight whilst climbing. And the aircraft handled it without drama, and it showed just how much thrust the afterburning Avon could produce when given the beans. But having said that, 2 months earlier, on the 26th of January 1956, prototype 35-1 had already exceeded Mark 1 in level flight, using an uprated Avon Mark 43 engine with no afterburner. This proved something fundamental about the double delta design. Supersonic flight was possible even without lighting the afterburner, which meant the wing's low drag characteristics were as good as the wind tunnel data had promised. For an aircraft designed with slide rules and wind tunnels and primitive computers, that was validation of Eric Bratt's fundamental aerodynamic concept. However, the celebrations didn't last long. A week after 35-2's accidental supersonic flight, the accidents began. During a landing run at Linköping, Ben Olo accidentally mixed up the controls, retracting the landing gear instead of deploying the brake parachute. The gear folded up and the aircraft dropped onto its belly. Fortunately, Olo was unharmed, but 35-2, unofficially nicknamed Gamea Mormor, or Old Grandmother, needed many months in the hangar for significant repairs. And then a month later, prototype 35-1 belly landed too. On the 19th of April 1956, test pilot K.E. Fernberg was on final approach for landing when he hit the switch to lower the gear. But there was a problem. The undercarriage indicator lights showed nothing. No green down unlocked, no red warnings either. He tried again, cycling the gear up, down, still nothing. And so after trying whatever he could, he reluctantly came in for a belly landing. Fernberg executed it perfectly despite landing on the wrong side of the main runway. The aircraft slid across the tarmac and, as you can imagine, caused a lot of damage to the underside. Fernberg, for his efforts, suffered a minor back injury. However, interestingly, the post-crash tests on the landing gear mechanism showed that it worked perfectly without any issues. What the records don't make entirely clear is whether the gear had actually extended and locked during the landing and Fernberg couldn't confirm it and the gear folded, or whether the indicator failure hid an actual malfunction. What is clear is that SAAB had just lost months of testing. With 2 of the 3 prototypes out of action, SAAB's test program was, to use the technical term, completely stuffed. Worse, the airboard was watching. 2 belly landings in such a short time, fingers were crossed that the third prototype wouldn't suffer the same fate. The third prototype, in fact, saved the program. FPL 35-3 made its first flight in September 1956, later than planned, but perfectly timed to take over testing duties whilst 35-1 and 35-2 were being rebuilt. This third aircraft was different from its predecessors. It was the first of the prototypes fitted with cannon armament, which meant SAAB could finally start weapons testing alongside aerodynamic work. By early 1957, SAAB had all 3 prototypes flying, with pilots and engineers trying to find all the inevitable problems that come with any new design. Some of these problems were minor, some were decidedly less so. Control sensitivity became apparent almost immediately. Draken was touchy around the pitch axis, far more sensitive than Little Draken had ever been. The combination of a tailless layout and a highly swept wing meant the ailerons, positioned far aft on the wing's trailing edge, had tremendous leverage for pitch control. Small stick inputs produced large nosed movements, which led to pilot-induced oscillations during approach and landing. Some pilots reportedly claimed, only half joking, that the oscillations could be set off by their heartbeat. This wasn't just annoying, it was dangerous. Several crashes resulted from pilots over-controlling the aircraft during critical phases of flight. SAAB's solution involved retrofitting less sensitive flight control systems to early aircraft, which helped but didn't entirely eliminate the problem. Draken would always demand smooth, precise inputs. Pilots who tried to muscle her around like a conventional fighter quickly discovered why that was a bad idea. Landing brought its own challenges. Pilot Bo Zenberg, who transitioned to Draken from conventional aircraft, described the adjustment. Coming from a trainer with nose down during approach, the high angle of attack was a new experience. Raising the nose immediately required more thrust. Also, the fact that you had to look somewhat sideways around the instrument panel to see the runway was initially an awkward feeling. But perhaps the most insidious problem involved the flight controls themselves at high speed and low altitude. During high-speed maneuvering, particularly at transonic speeds near sea level, pilots discovered something very unpleasant. Pull hard on the stick and not much happened. The ailerons deflected, but not fully. The problem was the hydraulic actuators simply weren't powerful enough to produce full control surface movement against the massive aerodynamic loads at high dynamic pressure. SAAB called this servo stall, though the term somewhat understated the problem. If your hydraulics can't move your control surfaces during high-G maneuvers at low altitude, you've got an aircraft that can't pull out of dives when you need it the most. Not exactly confidence-inspiring. The fix was clever, but it was symptomatic of the compromises inherent in the tailless Delta design. SAAB modified the flight control system so that when the pilot pulled more than 13 pounds of force on the stick, the upper air brakes would automatically deploy as maneuvering flaps. This increased the nose-up pitching moment, helping the pilot pull the aircraft through high-G turns even when the ailerons were reaching their deflection limits. It worked after a fashion, but it also meant Draken's sustained turn performance was never going to match aircraft with conventional tail surfaces. The delta wing generated tremendous amounts of lift in tight turns when the nose was pitched up high, but also generated tremendous amounts of drag. Think of it like using a barn door as an air brake. The wing was presenting a huge surface area to the airflow, slowing the aircraft down rapidly. Energy bled off rapidly, maintaining airspeed during tight maneuvers required all the available thrust. Sometimes even that wasn't enough. This wasn't a flaw exactly, it was the inevitable trade-off of designing an aircraft optimized for high-speed interception rather than dogfighting. Draken was meant to climb fast, accelerate to high supersonic speeds and destroy Soviet bombers. For that mission, the limitations were acceptable. In later years, Draken variants, especially the J35D and successors, pushed performance into the Mark II class with a service ceilings around 65,000 feet. We'll cover the later variants in part 2 of Draken's story. Some online sources I've seen claim that compared to typical figures for the Mirage 3, Draken had superior climb performance under certain clean or optimal conditions. For instance, when the Swiss put Draken head to head against the Dassault Mirage 3 in evaluation trials, Draken's climb rate turned out 20 to 40% superior. For context, that's the difference between we might catch them and we will catch them. Let me know what you think in the comments. Even though prototype testing would continue, it was time for Draken to go to work as an operational interceptor and find out if the Draken could defend Sweden from the bear. By 1960, Sweden had their supersonic interceptor. They'd done what many had thought impossible. A country with a tiny population compared to Russia, USA and even Britain had built what would become a legendary aircraft. The prototypes proved the aircraft worked, but Swedish engineers weren't yet finished, not by a long shot. Part 2 covers the Mark II versions, the export customers who actually bought Draken, and lots of pretty interesting stories I was able to dig up about the aircraft. So if you've enjoyed this first part, please leave a like or even a comment. Now on to part 2.